piece of work coming from inside out and being formed by the nature of residential culture and the notion of the external forces, and that no longer the building was differentiated by its approach to the various forces of the exterior. And it was no longer an idea of the singularity of a building, right? It was developing in terms of the multiplicities that take place, of differentiation. And again, everything came through drawings. Well, just after that, we're doing one of our first competitions in Berlin. We're invited to the AGB, American Gedenkbibliothek, and it becomes evident that the work is immediately kind of exploring urbanistic ideas, and there's no singularity. There's a fragment of existing Berlin, the 10% left after the war. There's a Platonic piece, which is the library. There's pieces of landscape and courts, all of them making up a more complex assemblage. At the time, it'd be Colin Rowe, it'd be collage, would be the discussion as a whole other thing. It moved from collage to something I think much more complicated than that. But those were the terms. And then right with that point, and I put little dates down here if you care, 92, we got one of our first larger commissions at the Crawford House, and we're now interested in landscape, and we're starting to realize that we're using different tactics for different projects. And at that point, I'm rejecting Kahn, the notion of the generation in front of me that an architect formed a language as his major life act. And we're going, no, we're trying to form as many languages, as many responses, but the key would go back to Ralph, that the work is definitely a response to the forces placed on it, and the formal language is a response to that and not a priori, right? And Kahn is the perfect example for a prioriness, meaning you think first and then put something down. It's coming out of a much more integrated response, and it's very reflective. I very seldom have an idea what a project's about. I have no idea, black. I need something to work with. I need some tension. I need some problem that I can go to work with, because I have no idea what an architecture should be. Blank, nothing, no vision, right? And complete uninterested in an idea. But now I got introduced to Heiser, and I went out to see the double negative, and I got completely smitten, and I'm off now for a couple of years with the Irwin, Smiths, and et cetera, and I'm interested in art, and it totally blew me away that you could dig and make space without object. And so I'm coming from Sterling, one of them, right? An object maker, the most kind of clear notion of a thing, right? And I'm now going, wait a minute, you don't even need it. And we couldn't get really what we wanted in this because they wanted a villa. And then right at the same time, in fact, this has been interesting to me, put these together, because I can't keep these in sequence. And when I look at them, I forgot we did this at the same time. We made, I thought, maybe the most significant shift in our firm, and that we were doing this competition that against Wolf Pricks and a bunch of people, and it's the Expo in Vienna. And it's a landmass that's connecting the UN Center, and I had actually been with Victor Gruen when Victor did the competition. I wanted to lost it, and I knew the project a little bit, the history of it. And we're using the landmass, and you look at the little pieces up there, and we're fragmenting, and we're using ground as program. And all of a sudden, figure ground disappeared, and ground and building become synonymous. And that I'm still doing it. That's one of my preoccupations. And then a couple years later, we got a project for the Chiba golf course, and we built the Crawford House the way we wanted to build it. The building's disappearing, and it's more and more operations on manipulating groundscape and organizing it, and it's connected to notions of rhythmic ideas in music. And again, I could talk about this in any number of ways. I talked years later with Philip Glass, and I did a discussion. We talked about multiple rhythmic events, and I redrew this and showed it as that, and he talked about it in terms of performing music. And then right after that, the Blades House, and it's now another kind of expression of part whole, but they're all parts making the whole, and that everything's fragmented and alludes to something. And it's going to connect to notions of future, unfinishedness, the dynamic of construction, and it's taking us someplace in terms of, it's going to lead into future urban work. And you might even say, as I'm looking at this right now, you could even see fragments of this in the Berlin project, but the pieces are still a little more coherent, and we're breaking the pieces up a bit and attacking those, and each of them alludes to some other state, and it's another way of connecting things. And we're seeing architecture, again, we're challenging the singularity. Okay, well, so here we are, and in 96, and there was a change took place. The digital environment came, right? And we're using these absurd quadras. If anybody here is old enough to remember those things, they have less power than your iPhone. And I remember this kid came from MIT, Mark, and showed up, and we were asked to do a competition in Copenhagen for a conceptual thing about a walk through the city of a kilometer. And I took a series of photographs and put them together. And each photograph kind of we interpreted to an image and made this thing. And it changed us forever. We are now producing something that you cannot draw, right? They can only produce both in terms of the initiating objects and the relationships of the objects, and we can crawl inside it. Right, and just like this, there was a big conversation in the office. Do we ease into computers and they do some things and we do other things in drawing? I said, no way. And literally all the drafting boards went to Okazu Orion in Tokyo. And in one day, we cleaned the place out and did it maybe the hard way. And then it led immediately to stuff. So we're working in Korea, and now we're looking at a skin, and we can deal with the geometry and the mathematics of this thing because we have a tool that we're learning how to use that can make this. And again, the basic fundamental idea is going to be the same, a differentiated edges. So when you see it from different places of the city, it keeps redefining itself. And it's in this case, they were a design group. So it was the Jim Dine. We were separating skin and body, and it became kind of very simple exercise. And then we got our first real piece of work. I remember walking through this with both Eric Moss and Richard Weinstein, and they said it was the first piece of architecture I did, and they were talking about the social act and the aesthetic act coming together, which is true. And we had got very, very lucky. All you guys out there, these guys will tell you that. There is a certain amount of happenstance, or maybe quite a bit of happenstance, because we're doing a school for the state of California, and they wanted guacamole stucco with tile roofs, and you have a standard budget, and we had this very unusual superintendent of schools in Pomona. And that thing you saw up in the corner, that's what I actually showed him. That was our now grounding. We're now moving through the landscape thing. And we're drawing it quite differently now. We're on a computer. And that's what I showed him. And then we built it. And then right with that, everything's taking place now with the digital. And it's just exploding the place. We're looking at forming something. And we can now have really complex, I'm missing something. Just before this was the NARA competition, and we used an elliptoid. We couldn't do anything with it. We built a mold. Mark McVeigh, does he teach here too? No? He did. Mark was working on the project, and we're starting to deform it and put it together. It took us a week to make the mold, to make the elliptoid, and we had like 4 weeks to do the competition. We said, screw that, and we started drawing it. And a year later, we've got a computer, and here we are in our competition for a theater, a series of theaters in the Rensselaer College, and we have the tools. And right with that now came model making, and we were the first person, I think, to buy a Form Z. And we're doing this, and again, we're moving at the speed of light now. And I now, at this point, have Marty Dosher in my office, a computer whiz who now heads up Dassault in Paris, and he's my Jim Klimpf. With Frank, he's rebuilding us in terms of a strategical approach of the methodology, and we're in a different place, and we can also do this, and we can rationalize it, and I'll show you in a minute if this keeps going. And then with these 3 projects, the third was the Hoopa Bank, first competition we won in Europe. I had breakfasts in the morning, and I was extremely frustrated getting to be a fairly difficult human being. At this point, I was maybe 46 or 47, and we just couldn't get any buildings. And we won this competition, and I learned what a difference it is to work in Europe. That to be an American architect is an enormous handicap. These people just said, do what you do, and you have a budget, you have a time framework, it has to work functionally, and just let you go. And I couldn't build this building today. In the 40 years I've been an architect, no fucking way could I build this building. Ooh, I promised my wife I wouldn't use that word anymore. I was told I'm approaching 70, that I have to be more diplomatic and dignified. And I can't use F words anymore, and she's really on me for that. And I promised her, don't tell her, okay? We got this project, and it was kind of a different kind of expansion. A bank in southern Austria, a conservative client, conservative use, conservative country, and it's like, this is nothing. Just go for it, and they love it, right? And we got it on budget, got it on time. And it was a different kind of development that it focused the office in a different way and gave us opportunities that were able to do this that actually propel you. And again, here we are now, and it came completely out of computer processes. Well, although we're kind of in between here. We're drawing and using a computer. And then the first kind of larger building in LA, an impossible project we built for $130 a square foot, competition. Political, public space, learning how to locate architecture lesson. A lot of my generation didn't learn that. Working with constraints. If I was going to give you a single piece of advice, the students, anybody can invent stuff open-ended. Constraints is what you have to deal with. That's 85% of architecture. The other part's easy. You can all do that. We can all make the drawings and do this. To get it done, you have to understand. And then part of dealing with constraints is how do you locate architecture in a project? Where do you invest your intellectual, creative capital, and where do you invest the dollars, the capital that goes behind that builds it? And you have to make decisions. And this was an incredible learning. We had a great team, and I lost certain battles that I should have lost, that I built a very, very straightforward chassis that let me do everything else. And it's the first time the word chassis came up. We started defining 80% of the building is bricks and mortar, right? It's structure, foundation, vertical movement, and MEP. What's left is the 20%. I'm maybe being overly optimistic. 15% is architecture. And you've got to be really clever. And so we built an insanely efficient chassis that gave us enough dough for even $130 is impossible. I got the best compliment I ever got in this building from Frank Gehry, who thought it was amazing. And if Frank could say that, he knows better than anybody how to make buildings out of cardboard and glass and glue, right? And it was, we worked with the kind of dynamicism. It's about Los Angeles, and it's infrastructural. And again, we're locating it in terms of the, this is the freeway builders. They build infrastructure. They build the infrastructure that makes LA unique as a city. And we use that as the idea. And then right after that, those projects got us this one. And we won a competition against Isesaki and a whole bunch of people to do this project in Cincinnati. Big project. And now we're full on the computer. We're making complex combinatory relationships, and we're making cities, and we have the tools to do it. And we were still working joint venture, because again, in this country, in Europe, you can be 35 and you're an adult and you can get work. Here, they put you with joint venture firms. For me, it was terrible because we did all the work still and got half the pay. And we were working with a very nice firm. He's been a big good friend of mine, KZF, who also did Zell House Building in Cincinnati. And they were a little bit arrogant. They saw our school and said, we can kind of clean that up a little bit. And then they got it. They didn't have a clue. And I said 10K, and he was still with me in New York, over there, and he solved all the problems and basically built it, right? They were not yet computer, and now we're just at the cusp where we're starting to be at the head of the curve. And it was really interesting. We were starting realizing ourselves that we were doing things that other offices couldn't do, and joint venture offices were useless. Now, we didn't need them, and we had to really work to be on our own. And we built this. And again, it could also talk about it in terms of public space, in terms of a non-building. It's about connective tissue. There's no elevation. It's one of the most interesting projects I ever had. I wish we could have more of them. And then we got another Hoopa Bank, and it's going to be very much about landscape and making new horizons. And we have a new landscape, and you now move between the layers of landscape. And as you move through it, you can control how you see out of it, and it has a huge amount to affect the public space and the public movement of the building. One of the things that's demands you having a practice is at some point you have to get certain type of work to grow. And again, that's a bit of luck of the draw. Everybody that's been around for a while knows this. And we were getting certain opportunities that ended up being really unusual. And we were, and by this time, this is, I'm probably 50 or young 50s right now, and we're starting to know more and more people. We're getting invited to things, and we're invited to do low-cost housing in Madrid. And for me, it was a phenomenal project. And then again, there'd be a whole conversation we might talk about as a social act and a cultural act, and I cannot see architecture as not political, and maybe that's my generation and be a conversation, right? And we got this, and you couldn't get this project in the States because it's stigmatized. And this is, in Europe, a common, the director of the museum will live in social housing in Amsterdam, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a fantastic, it was $60 a square foot, and we came up with a complete different typology that was used in the Moorish influence, which in fact was very much part of the history of Spain. And we built something that came out of the Kasbah. I spent time in Tehran and all through Morocco, et cetera. And we brought a very different kind of organizational idea, which was a social idea, communities. And there's all walk streets that come through. And as you hit the courtyards, you come up from the garage, and they're the social places that make communities. And it was just a really, really lovely opportunity. And then again, maybe the non secular stuff would be interesting, because I put these in chronological orders. These are overlapping. We won another commission in San Francisco, and it's going to be Caltrans, which is being pushed a whole piece, because now we're giving it the right shape, and we're taking the air conditioning out in the end. We're making it, I'm missing something. This is another marker in the office, and it represents the beginning of a strategic point of view. Up until this time, I still see myself, I see the office as designers in traditional architectural terms. We got this project, we won the commission, and before we even had a contract signed, there were all kinds of articles coming out in the papers and saying, oh, I can't use that word again, the F word. But they were using very tough language with us, saying we're going to come up and something their community. And we hadn't even got the job yet. And we sat down, and is John Enright been? Of course he was. He was here. John Enright is at this point working on the project, and we sat down and said, we have to find an approach to this, and we're going to talk about the use of energy, the work environment, and public space, urban public space, and never discuss aesthetics. And we did that, and it ended up being, again, a marker in the office that everything after this uses that strategy. Hey, I haven't seen you for a while. How you been? And it was a huge marker in the office. And it was funny because when we gave the final conversation, the opening, I got my little shot at my couple minutes, and I was with Nancy Pelosi, who has an office here, and she hated it. She wanted like a Victorian building. I go, Nancy, you can't build a Victorian building that's 14 stories high and it doesn't use energy. And I explained it to her. I said, by the way, you probably are going to be interested. We changed the workforce, and we put the staff on the outside and the management inside. And when you come up every 3 floors, there's a tea room and a conference room and a place people meet. And by the way, we took the air conditioning out. There's no air conditioning. And there's a very grand public space, and we did a study, and it powers 600 homes, the Delta. And it was really fascinating. Good idea, because it makes you it made her totally rethink why she likes or dislikes architecture, and not on just visual terms. Because if you're dealing with architecture solo visual, you're lost. We live there is no such thing as beauty, any singularity of aesthetics. We live and especially in this country, we live in a radically diverse culture that shares various culture, that shares notions of what beauty is. And it'd be like looking at us the way we dress. It'd be absolutely absurd if you're going to use that as your criterion. It has to go another step into first principle. And if you can't do that, you're decorating. You really, if you're not making money, you shouldn't complain, because everybody thinks they can do what you do. They can go home and make the sketch, right? You're way off. And we got into performance, and with the strategy, seeing architecture as strategic, it was again it had multiple tasks, and the performance became now way in the forefront, which started at Caltrans as a discussion. Oh dear, I'm at 20 minutes. I'm really horrible. Again, now we're doing a courthouse. God, I got to really go. The courthouse, they wanted the Supreme Court. And we said, well, probably not, and we did this. And that was a kind of a long venture. And then we're working on the
Take your time, because you're answering all my questions. So.
And then at Caltech, we're now looking again at kind of the relationships of multiple systems that kind of invent new things. And again, it comes out of the digital environment. It allows us to produce, and it was going to be a kind of a quasi-telescope, or a kind of way of reaching Earth to sky, and as this kind of connected tissue. And then the Cooper, it's again about urban. And here it's all about locating the work. Taught budget, the sites given, the envelopes given, we're attacking it from the outside, and the energy is finding its way to the street and is finding its way through this vertical space. And this project was all about, it's a well-known school of architecture. It had a huge amount to do with my formation. Hayek was another one of my characters at one point in my life. And it's something that actually had a lot to do with forming SARC. It was we were looking at the AA, we were looking at Cooper as our models in some way, or at least they were kind of hovering around the edges as we're doing that. And we made decisions of where this energy goes in this very, very simple building, and it went into the street, and it went into the interior, and we made this kind of space that was a vertical piazza, and the whole notion of the school was to connect art, engineering, and architecture, and we had a very kind of clear program. And now we're going to go back to land stuff, and this is now just a couple of years ago, and we're working in Shanghai, and I'm going to jump forward just to some of my own research. I've been working on drawings that talk about a combinatory language, and they're researching new methods of organization. I think our basic thing we do is organize things, and I think we have extremely limited notions of how we organize things. And some of them are still incredibly located in the classical system, and others are on compositional, and I have absolutely no interest in composition. I'm looking for a type of a casual chance and willfulness, the relationship of those two things. And using chance as an operational strategy, but organizing chance, and it's going to come directly from, it starts with Duchamp, and it's going to go to splatter painter, Pollock, and it's going to go to ARP in the 60s and a whole bunch of guys. And it's a preoccupation of the 20th century. So I'm working on a project that's been taking place for the century, and it's going to translate right into this kind of abstract thing that goes right into a plan, that goes into 3D. And now I'm fulfilling my interest that started with the school. And that piece you're saying is the conference room, and it's over the lake. Everything's connected to the interior nature. And like the models of the fragments of Vienna competition, this case, 75% of the building is ground, and is a cut operation. And it's also using a language that I've been working with for a long time that came out of the drawings, and everything's connected to the relationship of 4 primitives and the numbers of variations. And the interest was that there's no spaces alike. You can cut a section through every meter of the building for 400 meters, and it's never equal. And I'm looking at a more biological model for organization than a traditional. And then just recently, the building in Dallas, and it's going to share building landscape. It's going to share now a kind of a shift in technology. Again, very, very tough budget. And this one now, I guess if we were going to get into it, it'd be more about the tectonic. We made the screen with Gates. We developed the idea. We literally made the molds in our studio, brought them over, worked back and forth for a year. Before the building was open, I'm opening up Architectural Record, and there's an ad for it. We're 6 months away from opening the building, and they're advertising. And my wife saw it, who's an MBA, and she looks at it and goes, "I already know what the answer is going to be. You didn't get a royalty in this, right?" And no, I didn't. And they're literally selling. And this is another thing that's actually quite important. The digital is allowed us form changes. It allowed us to deal with performance in a different way, and it allows us to do the tectonic, which puts us back in the driver's seat. We're making things, and in this case, we made this skin for $50 a square foot, and that was a $100 delta, a third. And we took the $100 and made it look like an expensive building. And now you look at glass on cables, super, super expensive. And then the glass and the curved thing makes this look expensive. And the whole building looks like we spent $800, and it wasn't. But it's, again, differentiating where you invest the time and understanding that you now control the invention and the making of the product. And then a building that's just about finished here, the Emerson building. And again, this is going to go in 2 different directions. We're working with the process of making more complex form. So this is in Zahner, and it's now made in big planks and brought out to the side and put together. And we've got somebody in his shop Great shop, by the way. It's everybody knows Tom Farage. It's Tom Farage on steroids, and we're working with Surface, and we're now kind of shifting. We kind of went through the screen, and we made no more screens. Let's go someplace else in the office. We've been there, done it, and we're working with scripting, and that'd be another conversation. Because now I have a specialist, a scripter that's coming up with, they claim infinite numbers, but we could look at the component parts and kind of what its implication is at a global level, and some construction photographs of the real building. This is kind of weird, and this kind of sky looks like a drawing, doesn't it? That's the building. And this is all about in-between space, which is going to be very much connected to my work drawing. Looking at all, I've loved the interstitial stuff. When I'm in Paris, I mean, the Houseman is kind of boring. You do that, okay, you've done it. I'm looking for all the collisions over history, and I'm trying to find a way of organizing those events that find the kind of complexity over time that are so interesting. And this one's all about spaces between. I built a little urban environment up here, and it's crowded and congested. And then, of course, the last work that hopefully will get built, the FAR Tower. And again, you're going to see it's a collaboration of buildings. It's not a single building. It's four things put together, and the thing itself changes. So again, going back to the very first image, as you move around the city, you keep seeing different connections of this building. And then an LED lighting, which is in a way a drawing, and talks about the lyrical nature, because this is again about a building that's half lyrical, half performance, because this is an energy skin that follows the sun. And then this currently, and actually on this one, 350-meter tower in Shenzhen, just started construction. Funny thing, I'm going to leave you with a problem. More difficult, simpler job than the Crawford House. Not as many opportunities. And I think I'm watching it happen to a lot of people my generation as people get older. It seems like the opportunities get better, they get bigger, etc. They move more and more commercial, and I'm worried about it. And I'm actually thinking, is it time to kind of wrap it up or move my interest someplace else? And we're pushing pretty hard, and we're going to get part of this. We're going to get it built, a big chunk of it. But it's a struggle, and it's really, I think there's a shift going on in architecture today. The ownership is being removed from architects, and I can definitely see it in my own career. And it's the opportunities are lessening as this period of hyper capitalism is expanding, right? These people want to control their investment, and then really quickly. The other part of my life, which I'm actually spending a lot of time right now, I started the Now Institute 10 years ago, and we're producing urban initiatives, essentially. And we went to Madrid and redid planning with the, there you're working directly with the head of urban design and the planner and the mayor, et cetera. And then our own work, I decided there's very few books on actual projects, a lot of theory. We put a book out that had 12 of our projects, and then we tried to make them extremely clear and make it just about a manual. And it comes out of the office. We did the LA Dodger Stadium, and that'd be a whole conversation. I took this to the Villa Rugosa. Everybody knew McCourt was going to go bust. We had done a study at UCLA on this, and could put 30,000 people on the site. You could see the ocean. We could do it both on low level for families. You're 5 minutes from downtown, straight down Figueroa on the bridge, or you could do high rise with golf courses and open space. We did various typologies, and we could move Dodger Stadium right next to the new Orange Line. And for the park, because we did this with James Corner, a competition, couldn't even get anybody interested. This is a city, nobody is interested in anything that has to do with a large-scale project. And we worked with the guy that designed Staples, Michael Harrison, somebody. It was a really real project. And we did an economic study and discussed how it would be paid for, et cetera. And then again, right after that, with the LA Now, we did the Float House. We built a house in New Orleans. And again, now we're using, it's a whole new idea, and we built a house that has a chassis, et cetera. And then the Haiti project, and I just came from that. We're working now in Haiti. We're doing 3 projects: a small women's clinic, a housing community, and a macro project of cleaning up a river. And then last, just finished a series of objects and drawings, and started this about 2.5 years ago, and it's my research. And I'm continuing to, I started drawing and looking at drawing as a very particular type of research, and I'm continuing to do that. Thank you so much. Okay, it's all you. Do they know the rules?
I'm still not convinced there were rules.
No. I gave him this presentation last week, but he gave me nothing, and that's the rule. I wanted to know completely extemporaneous, right? So he could say whatever he wants to say, and it's up to him.
And Tom, thank you. Am I lit?
You want to turn the lights up now?
No, I just was hoping I'm mic'd, but I'm not sure I am. No, Tom, thank you, and thank all of you for having me. It's actually a real honor to be invited here to speak with you. And just at the school, I was thinking in Patrick's introduction that allusion to invisible cities, I think, is a really apt one for Los Angeles right now, and especially the way our kind of plenitude of incredibly strong architecture schools relate to one another. In many respects, they each seem like a different one of Calvino's environments that are each going after some interestingly common themes and well, in very, very diverse ways. But the thought that followed that one, Tom, was that to the degree they share a common purpose, and I think they really do, I think a lot of the discussion of architecture in Los Angeles has to do with the question you kept coming back to of dynamism. How you set architecture in motion in more provocative ways. How actually we answer what is, frankly, still in a lot of the more established academies of the East Coast, a question of architectural presence with compelling, convincing questions about how architecture can instead be about change and new possibilities rather than kind of reasserting its authority and its value. I think here we're more interested in what thinking about architecture can teach us about the field itself and others. But I do want to say this. Tom sent his presentation to me last week in a slightly revised form. I've seen it in radically chronological order. And based on that presentation of the work, I came up with these following questions. I'm just going to read you the headings of them because, frankly, Tom has touched on most, if not all of them tonight. So as I mentioned earlier, he's covered a lot of my ground, and I want to try to open this up to the field as quickly as I can. But these were the questions I was coming with, the headers. And the first was drawing beyond drawing, and I certainly want to come back to that one. The next one was teaching architectures. And I want to challenge you, looking at the work collectively, I think the question of school in your methodology and its role in your life and your role in schools, and the way schools factor into design innovation in your office is truly unique. I really want to come back to that one. A third, these were the three I was going to get if I only got three, was about atelier culture. And I know we're surrounded here by an incredible array of really innovative characters that have come out of your office. This too is unique to Morphosis. We have a lot of incredible firms in LA. Yours is the one with the legacy of really dynamic, remarkable figures, operating after their time with you, I think. Come back to whether there are any that challenge that. But the other ones, I was interested in, these are three that actually had more to do with sort of specific design issues. Skin and pattern and the way that the planar becomes spatial in your work seems like a driving and consistent question through. I think it ties back to the question of drawing. A second, and this one I don't think we'll necessarily come back to, but it's perhaps a minor one, but historically salient one. The role of the cantilever in your work I'd like to talk about it because you're of a generation. There was a moment in the 1990s when a lot of people were trying to do different things with cantilevers, and I think actually those differences mattered 20 years later. And finally, the idea of the vignette, and you touched on this a little bit. I think this relates in our conversation a couple of weeks ago. We wound up a little bit with, we were talking a little bit about Jeff Kipnis and how he comes to your work. But I think one of the really compelling, valuable observations he makes about your work is that often it comes together with this incredible clarity and salience in specific moments. And going through the slides last week, I was struck by the strength, in particular, of images that captured interior spaces for the most part, places where the patterns and systems were all coming together, perhaps intersecting, perhaps giving way to one another, but spaces that frankly kind of proved the overall thesis of complexity in a way that in many architects' work they end up, frankly, doing the opposite. And finally, and these are broader questions, and you touched on a little bit, the question of performance. You talk about, and I think you actually explained in San Francisco how the discussion of performance in prosaic terms serves the work and serves the possibility of furthering the work. But I want to talk about performance in terms of how you describe your work in disciplinary terms, because frankly, I think you're performing in a more multivalent way than you want to necessarily present the work to clients. But I think in this audience, that's a message worth expanding on. And finally, music, we could talk a little bit about. I'm curious about the difference between your interest in jazz, Gary's in classical, and Wolf Pritzker's constant invocation of the Rolling Stones. And finally,
he wants to be Keith Richards.
Well, and I'm sorry, I wanted to get kind of my cards on the table. I feel like this is sort of a this is very much a game of, it isn't Texas Hold'em. What is it when you play with, actually Texas Hold'em may have half the cards open on the table. Okay. But if you could you expand a little bit on, I want to start with the drawing beyond drawing question, because when we first met, really in passing 20 years ago, you made the observation that you built on tonight, that in the early 90s, you found yourself at a threshold where, as you put it then, you couldn't draw what you were interested in anymore, that having been really driven by this kind of manual dexterity and kind of dialogue between mind and hand in the early work, all of a sudden you were beyond those possibilities. The digital tools were starting to make new things possible. How do you see, and you came back to them a couple of times, but these hybrid composites, these urban hybrid composites, and I think I'm correct here that those last ones that you showed are named often for two cities that I think have been sort of run in cross-strait between each other.
American and Chinese hybrid.
Okay, and it's that more specific. How would, if you had to draw some connection between that very recent work and going back as far as the work that was shown in Heretics, the exploded AXO of the 2468 house, how would you explain the passage from those early modes of representation, what they gave you, and the current ones?
It's interesting because actually the last set of drawings and the models, the reliefs, whatever they are, happened in a very serendipitous way. We were moving our office from Colorado, and we were building our space in the one you saw in Culver City, and we couldn't get it done right. We moved into temporary space, and part of the moving was consolidating stuff, and I was bringing storage stuff out from San Bernardino, and I had to open up all the crates to look at it. And I was the only one that actually knew we had to say yes, they're in good condition. And I was going through it, and I'd forgotten, I'd been kind of a real architect for 15 years now, and I'd stopped doing a lot of the conceptual stuff, the drawings and the models. And again, in the beginning, I don't know how it happened. It was very clear that these were both about the work and somehow autonomous from the work. And the autonomy maybe was the one I was most interested in, but it wasn't the work, so that there was no attempt to make realistic models in every sense, although they had the basic components of the architecture, but they were stripped down in a way and then layered with colors, and I was interested, I think, in some sort of an emotional content, really. And the ones you're talking about, I'm looking at these things, and I came across this model in the upper corner, and then this one I put up behind me, and we just had this temporary office for a year, and I put it behind me. And then at the same time, I came up with all this materials, and we were working at the drawings we were doing that I didn't show a lot of. We were working with minerals, and the drawings or paintings were using graphite and copper and aluminum dust and et cetera. And it was put on with a knife, and they were embedded with stuff. And I came across kind of buckets of this stuff. And I just go, God, I haven't done this for a while. And I got started in this project. And I gave it as a project in the school, which will connect to your next question. I gave it to a group I was working with at Cornell, who was kind of tough. They didn't get it. And I came back and then started working on it collectively. So these are, they're me as a thought leader. I didn't draw a line. They're done on a computer, and I'm going go here, denser here, add here. I'm changing the nature of the piece, and that's gonna be I'm a cusp guy. I'm not a computer guy. I can barely. You saw me. This is the maximum what I can do at a computer right now. And if anything went wrong, I had to ask for help. So it's also interesting, but that goes way back to the beginning. It's funny as you get older. Sometimes you realize every idea you had when you were 18. And you just keep working out different points, and you're going, did I actually have a new idea since I was 18 years old, or maybe not? When we did Morphosis, I'm here with, I would have said, the last generation of modernism, and it's the Ains and the Harwell Harrises, and it's Craig Elwood and Sariano, that gang, and Pierre Koenig, who did probably one of the most amazing pieces of architecture in Los Angeles. But they were done. That era was over. Right? And you can smell it. And when you're young, when you're your age, you have no clue. It's like music or anything culture. You just get it. This is like, you know it because you're young, right? And then I was heading over to UCLA, like I said, and it became really clear there was a change in the air. And it had to go back to your dynamicism and a kind of a complete shift of what architecture was. And of course, at the same time, modernism was being challenged. And we were just reading, I can't remember, as a senior or just coming out of school, we were reading Complexity and Contradiction, and that blew your head, that blew your brain off. I can go back, I forgot, I just looked at it again. You only have to read the first 6 pages, in my opinion. The rest of it's nonsense. The first 6 pages, a huge amount of architects could put that as their introduction and be fine.
Yeah, and
hybridization, complexity, it was an amazing piece. And then he went to his historical stuff, and you're getting a particular person, how he translates it, and he's translating it. Well, he's from Philadelphia, and it's a little taut for somebody in LA or many of the new emerging global cultures, right? And that was taking place. They kind of completely shifted this. And anyway, I put this thing up, and I was doing the drawings. The whole studio, and I do it very quietly. I'm working. We don't talk about the work at all in the studio. It's just done with this one. I'm working with one guy, and we start putting these pieces up. And by the way, the models came first. The drawings are interpretations of the model, which I did in the Lawrence house. I did the drawings when the project was done. It was a therapeutic. It was a catharsis process. Right? The project was built and constructed, and I was trying to figure out where to go, so I just drew it again and tried to figure out what I did wrong and where it'd lead me. And so I did the same thing. The drawings follow the 3D, so the things are produced in a 3D environment. Anyway, I put these up on the wall. It's hilarious. And I have 50 people here, 55, 60 people. Everybody went, Tom, you're back to this one. You're doing it again. Same project, which it is, right? 25 years ago, but you have new tools. And so I was just at a meeting at UCLA with a bunch of science types, and we were discussing, one of them was an astrophysicist who just won a major award for discovering the largest black hole. And we were discussing what would have Copernicus made the same discoveries if he had Hubble? And there's no question. The answer is yes. If he had the eyes of Hubble, or Galileo, ditto. In the terms of the religious environment, he'd have probably been strung up still. But if you had those, right? And what happened is that you're looking literally at that project. Well, I've kind of tuned it now because I'm more interested in the chant. I was using rhythmic things here, and it's kind of now I move into interstitial and chants, and I'm kind of shifting the project a bit. But it's the same project still. And it's made up of 4 elements. This had 6. And the relationship of that discipline of those pieces. Because the things you're looking at, which I didn't say, the drawings, there's 25 of them, 25 objects, they're all made of the exact same 4 pieces. So they have the identical DNA matter. And I'm seeing how many differentiated things I can make out of that organization.
I'm wondering if I could drag those 4 into Banham's 4 ecologies by some rhetorical trick. But I actually, Tom, it seems to me like that the representational side of your practice has an incredible consistency to it. The drawings from beginning to end seem to be about generating fields perhaps of indeterminacy, or more maybe specifically recursion. And it seems as though it's interesting to me that that you drew after the houses, and I think you drew after the houses to make objects into fields again. Now that you're actually operating at a scale where building becomes field whether you want it to or not, they precede or parallel the work maybe in a different way, but it seems like that impulse to generate to develop a field condition and then explore methodologies for developing dynamism and variation through it. To me, this is where your project is Duchampian, but of actually a higher geometric order. If Duchamp takes a yard of yarn and drops it and studies the deviations in shape and the standard stoppages, those silhouettes.
Right.
It's a linear. It's basically, it's a two-dimensional geometric question where I think consistently in your work, the problem of how to three-dimensionalize indeterminacy seems really pressing, and consistent in a good way. But
Duchamp is also changing the rules, so he's making a new meter.
Almost all, I mean,
right?
I think in that sense.
I've always been interested in the rule-basedness of architecture. And to change architecture, you change the rules. You have an operational method, and to change the work, you change the operational method that gives you a new output. And I think that's kind of what you do in school. You're invested in the nature of the process.
Where our rules get laid down and how we choose to abridge them, follow them, or
and then the connection you asked about the schools, it's inseparable. Again, I was learning architecture when I taught architecture. When we started SARC, I was 27 years old, and I hadn't got not a clue what architecture was.
But Tom,
and so the teaching, and for years, my students were my office, and they were inseparable.
But I think it's a more thoroughgoing connection than that. I mean, even going through your portfolio, your schools in your work have marked turning points that they do for very, very few people. Frankly, academic commissions, for most architects, are ways of fortifying a practice so that you can keep going about your business and doing more interesting work on houses and cultural institutions. That is not the pattern for you. Diamond Ranch, even the one down in Long Beach, though we didn't, but they're major and minor. Diamond Ranch, Cooper, the mega campus in China, and now Emerson. It seems to me like schools are more often than not where you actually test a new paradigm rather than kind of going through, frankly, going through the academic motions. And it's interesting to me that that's where that frankly, your particular talents and enthusiasms inspire those kinds of possibilities in a situation that they often don't for other people. But how just basically intrinsic that whole, again, kind of recursive process of discussing possibilities, challenging them, trying a new set of options, it seems intrinsic to the way you work. Is that a fair?
I never think about it that way. It's just a project. And there's usually a disconnection of the project and how it shows up in the office and your interests. You have no choice. People call you and you get a job, you don't get a job. And so they're incredibly haphazard. And I don't even think of them in terms of types. I just go to work solving the problem and using the best opportunities I can get. And I'm a persistent guy. I keep kind of push. And again, I'm going to say as an architect in this country, you have to be persistent. Getting work done. So we share a kind of a weak profession, and we're under the domain of people that finance our work and have to come to grips with trying to understand it. And nobody understands architecture. Nobody. When people say they listen to a client, it's absolute nonsense. You listen to a client in informal, in diplomatic terms, of course. And I learned to do that even as a kind of crazy guy. And you also start talking on their terms. You don't talk about architecture. You talk about something they understand, because nobody understands architecture. I work with a lot of very bright people. Judge Hogan was a very, very bright, youngest Chief Justice of the United States, came out of Georgetown when he was something like 19, and a bright guy. He knew nothing about architecture. He was a child. It just wasn't his area. It's an esoteric field. And most of my time with him was through education, saying, this is what, let me take you to Paris. And I took the biggest move in that job. I took him to Paris, and we visited Bordeaux and Richard Rogers in Bordeaux, and I went to see in Nantes John Nouvel. He got it like that. When I took him to Nouvel, he just about dropped dead. Here's that word again. I just can't work with that word. Because he knew that Nouvel was really totally fucking around with the judge. Because Nouvel just loves that. That's who he is. He just is going to poke and prod and screw around with you, and he's got a great sense of humor about it. And he looked at it as a judge, and he met his counterpart of the court. You know the building, the Messian play. and the black with the red courtrooms, with the tiger cage Vietnam light coming through that makes you look like you're dead. It's a blue fluorescent light. I mean, it's just outrageous. And when he saw it, it had nothing to do with the formal architecture. He understood the position of the architect. That's why I took him. It wasn't because these are buildings that have anything to do with what we're going to do. This is what architects do in France, meaning they have power. They actually have ideas that get built. And he's expecting a courthouse in this country, which is nothing. It'll look like an office building, not even a very good office building sometimes. And they get it. And he goes, okay, I understand why you took me here. These guys are strong guys that have ideas that actually got them built.
And this gets at I think, an interesting sociological question that came to a head in your generation and around, as you pointed out, differences between U.S., European, and arguably Asian understanding of how architects work. But what you're talking about, Thom, is the way you made a patron of a client. The way you found a way to convince a client that there were higher aims, there were other possibilities beyond meeting a brief that really were worth pursuing. And I think, just to go briefly back to the school question, I think your faith in education, self-education, and in working with other people to raise everybody's game is so infectious that I think it has had a profound effect, positive effect on the schools. But I think it does pervade it pervades the other projects, and it's interesting to hear how the European architects of your generation, you mentioned Nouvel and Bernard Tschumi our conversation last week started with the talk you had with Tschumi in the spring with Everything Loose Will Land. And it's interesting to me, Thom, Bernard Tschumi, and Rem Koolhaas are all born in 1944. A common year so pardon my well, not yet 70, and in fact not yet 70. Not yet 70. It's an important year, and that generation who are born literally in the wake of World War II, but who come of age in the 60s, really are teenagers through the 60s and seeing those major transformations in different parts of the world have had a undue influence on, not undue, but a profound influence on the direction of our field in very, very different ways. And one question, my last that I was going to hold off on and start you with, but I don't. I am curious about how the now research and books that you've been working on, and Koolhaas's project on the city start to set up questions about globalization and urban space and how they inform architecture in radically different ways. And I think I would suggest ways that are tied to, as you described, your experience of post-war American prosperity, of frankly growing up well in California and developing an enthusiasm for how to make this environment actually more interesting, where Koolhaas actually approaches those questions with a very different disposition. He actually is not only party to the rebuilding of Rotterdam in his childhood, but spent some time in Indonesia and has the kind of post-colonials.
Right. There's two different
sort of the two big
there's two different
city people.
answers to that. One is has to do with my own trajectory and where I'm at in my life at this current time, and I have a very different attitude towards the formal in architecture than I did when in my 20s and 30s. That lasted probably through being 50 or so, and especially in its kind of singularity, because I was somebody that committed myself to the formal, and we were criticized for it. The word fetish came up a lot, and I did my little stump speeches with the AAA all over the country. And I have to tell you, every time they give a speech, they invite you to come there, and you're going to Nebraska and Kansas and North Dakota and doing your little things for a couple $100, and you're giving a talk at the end of it, and this is the AIA. They always said, well, interesting work, but you're not a real architect. House, drawings. And I remember in San Francisco, I gave a thing after we built we'd built some large work, and I got really angry, and I told the AA, okay, I did it. Now I'm a real architect, so screw you. and because I was really, really upset with being 20 years of not doing real work. But but later you realize, and a huge amount of people who will do this, there are very different opportunities in doing a house, a cafe, a little shop, a facade, stuff. And there aren't huge issues that touch culture, ecology, urbanism, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And you are working within you're proving yourself within formal terms in simple organizational firms, and you can get a job done on budget and all that kind of stuff, the pragmatics of architecture. And it wasn't until we got to larger work, the school that I showed you, that all of a sudden we touched reality. But you have to have the opportunity to do that. But you're getting criticized. We're going, hey guys, these are the projects that people are giving me. This is all I can do at 40 years old, and it's the best I can do, and that's the end of it. And then later, you have to ramp up, because that's the step everybody makes here, as you get the school, as you get the larger urban project, because all of a sudden it does have huge implications, urbanistic, pragmatic, infrastructure, on and on, right? And and then I think what's happened at this point in my life, I find the most compelling projects, especially as a teacher, in the urban infrastructural area. That architecture, my anticipation, your generation, the problems of the world today, global is way too simple and too general. The problems are going to have to do with the intensive urbanization that's taken place over the last 50 years, starting at the second half of the 20th century. That's radically accelerated in the 21st. And they're going to be urban, and I'm most interested because nobody knows how to do them. The Team 10 CIM were the last coherent urban project. They could speak about things infrastructurally in every urban sense, right? They could discuss it in social, political, cultural terms, and they had very, very coherent conversations, agree or disagree. They were coherent conversations. Urban design disappeared in '80 from schools, and it's kind of trickling back now at the precise time we need it. When now you're in China, jobs start at like 2 million square feet, and that's like a traditional, that's like the throwaway, right? And I'll be seeing Steve Hall tomorrow night. He gets these projects are all 3-4 million square feet. And what he needs is an urban strategy. And I just look at it, and that's the reason we did combinatory. It seems to me there's very few ideas on the table and very few coherent conversations still on how we treat cities and problems that are now no longer the megacity, which is, it seemed like it was my education. It was megastructures and it was Tangi, et cetera, right? It was just, it seemed like it was yesterday. Today, that's the problem. And then you look at whether it's in this country, whether it's in this city. So I look at the Dodger Stadium problem and go, that's really the interesting problem. That's the one I want to do. A really serious project that changes the city, and it's absolutely doable, and you have a strategy of how doing it, and you could be the person, you're still the only one trained to do this. The real estate people can't do it, financial people can't do it, builders don't do it. We're still trained to deal with complex, intricate problems, multifaceted problems. And it seems to me that's the most compelling problem. And so my energy right now is all with my teaching, is with LA Now. I just left my class, and the discussion was even how to present the project, because they're used to explaining it formally. And I'm going, no, what a waste of time. You're drawing, you don't have to say a word, you show it, it's there, you don't have to say anything about it. We understand two lines are crossing each other, it's about a penetration, one thing, the other. I go, duh. I go, no, you have to put it within historical terms, and you have to say, why is this even an interesting project? And if you cannot connect the dots, you can't move forward, right? Does this have any implication in shaping behavior? Does it change us in any way, or does it solve any problem that we can articulate? And if not, no wonder we're broke. We're not solving any problem. Nobody needs us, nobody wants us. We don't do anything that's really relevant other than the aesthetic. And I think, again, maybe because I've been through that cycle, it's time that we move on from a radical overinvestment of the aesthetic.
Can I ask you about your museum? Because a museum would at first appear to beg kind of architecture for architecture's sake questions. And I guess, could you take us through what I think is a kind of cultural infrastructural case for that building? And in particular, Thom, I guess I'm wondering, we're going to open the Broad Museum next year. Both of these were actually interesting to me initially for the strictly formal curiosity that they both involve cubes, that they're both remarkable. Cubes actually aren't easy to make into gallery space. It's hard to span that and light it and bring light down through it. But what's interesting to me about Perot is that now I'm wondering if for you, the compelling aspect of this project is less maybe the cube and what your contractors are already, or your subcontractors already, your suppliers are already selling without any residuals, and more the mat that surrounds it and the way that moves to the city's edge.
Probably shouldn't do this, but I will. We're doing this at the same time we're doing the ground project in Shanghai. There he is, Mario. Headed up the Shanghai project. And this is just after, I guess, right? We're starting just after that. And it was going to be a form. And the schematic ended up with this, a ground form that kind of grew out of that. And the schematic, I'm called in on a Saturday to meet the head of the board, the director, and one of the head fundraisers. Tom, are you willing to change the building? If not, we're going to let you go. Guess what? It had to be orthogonal. I had 1 hour. Can't use escalator. Has to be orthogonal. I forgot the third one. Think about it. We'll give you an hour. Went out, got a cup of coffee, rattled around in my head, and came back and said, all right, we'll figure it out. And that was a big change for me, because normally I would have definitely said, you take a walk. Went to work on it. And I guess I'm supposed to be getting older, but it doesn't seem to be helping a lot. But it takes a certain amount of flexibility to continue. And then we went to work, and the first thing I said, you know Rem built the theater as a cube. And I literally said right to him, I said, no. I said, I don't want to be, you don't want us to compare to Rem. He just built the cube, the theater, a nice project that he's been working on for 30 years. And you don't want to make that comparison. I said, you know that critics will make that connection, and it's not a connection good for you, and it's not a connection good for me. And it's funny, strangely enough, it didn't happen. So that's also kind of whatever reason. And we went to work on it, and then I put the escalator back, and I only put the escalator back, but I put it on the outside so everybody could see it. And that was a definite, to you. And by the way, though, this is the lesson. I came back 2 nights ago from Dallas. It was the year anniversary, and I'm kind of well liked there. It's a very popular building. It's been immensely successful, and all 3 characters I saw, the head of directors, the head fundraiser, and the director of the institution, Nicole Small, they love my ass. We're like best buddies in the history of mankind. And I was joking in my office, all my key people went to the opening, and we were joking, when you go through these, you put up the biggest fight you can put up, and they're going to a lot of times hate you. But in the end, you have to succeed. If you succeed, everything goes away. They forget everything. All right? And we just fought it out, and it's a weird thing to me because I see it. I can always see the cube. It had nothing to do with me. It just showed up as a cube. But then I started thinking about it, and when we won the competition for Cooper, it was a zoning envelope. It was done. An envelope, it was what it was. I go, well, this is not that unusual. It seemed weird because it was personal and not connected to any kind of a strategical thing. It's just a personal interest, and I see it as so evasive of architects. Because architecture is a contact sport. I mean, you're out there working. And I'm at a point in my life, if I wear out, it won't be the creative part, it's getting in the ring. Half of my life, I'm living up here. The other half, I'm in the ring. Right? You got it? And the ring part, I'm a pretty big guy, and I still go to the gym, and it gets a little old at a time.
And I'll testify, you actually eat well. Granola and fruit at our breakfast. But Tom, I'd love to open this up more broadly, and I'd like to kind of do it with a question leading into that. It was my third one, and it was both, in certain respects, the most important and most heartfelt in some ways, was about atelier culture. And I've given some thought to how different practices build a set of questions or possibilities that end up sustaining the practice for however long it takes, but also open up avenues of inquiry for the people that work with you. And I really do think, frankly, you're unique in this city for how people have left your practice and become compelling figures in their own right. And there are counterexamples, but I think the obvious counterexample I won't name leaves a lot of people actually, I think, date stamped by their time working.
Yeah, there is a really simple answer for that, and these guys will shake their head or not, because there's a bunch of them here. But
let me name a few, just because it's ridiculous how many there are. I mean, McKelly's here, Patrick and I are exactly contemporary in school. I mean, like you've launched the most, like the most prolific searching character in my generation in this city. I think George Yu, who is really beloved of all of us, and then the partnerships. Griffin Enright, Iwamoto Scott, Craig is your.
Selwyn's here.
You've had. I mean, frankly, you've had more proteges that have gone on to become voices in their own right than the rest of the LA practices combined since Gruen. And that's a remarkable, I mean, I think, to me, that's a real testament.
That's interesting. I worked at Gruen just long enough to steal everything. Amazing environment. I showed up there. I'm 22, 23 years old, just out of school. And they give you the key. It's fantastic. And I remember I was on a design team doing a city plan for Long Beach. And the head of it, who was a project manager, somehow just mysteriously disappeared and nobody knew where he went. And they came to us, and it was Kisu Park at the time, and he was right under a guy named Edgardo Cotini, who was partner with Victor. And they said, anybody here want to take it over? And I just go, I'll do it. And they go, okay, you're a project manager. I was there for like 3 months. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was this amazing horizontal environment that I just hugely respected. And then parallel to that, before that, I was going over to Archigram. That's where I took my name. I stole it from them. Archigram, collective practice, different characters working on different projects, totally dynamic notion of what a practice is, closer to the movie industry. And I had gotten to know Ron Herron a little bit in my visits to UCLA, and actually got hired by him when he was going to work for Pereira, but he got fired quicker than I could even get the job. And it completely came from Archigram and as a collective practice. And out of that, I joke with these guys. I'm kind of a manager. I'm never sure kind of what I do. Everybody in my office designs stuff. And I've learned years ago when I talk about my project, it's we. And if I say I'm going to get screwed up because maybe I didn't do that. And I can't keep track. I don't worry about it. I have no notion of who puts the line down. And I'm going to forget whether it was let's just literally a sketch I did. I'm going to forget who's put the idea on the table. And I could care less. And I think it's also that'd lead to your answer, because it's usually their work would be the answer. And I'm guiding the ship somehow. And I'm a teacher still, maybe. I'm still in that level. I'm a thought leader. And that came, by the way, as our big projects. I was using Paul Nakazawa. Has he been here? He organizes offices in terms of how you manage and think about yourself. And he was the first person that said, you're no longer a designer, you're a thought leader. You're way beyond that. And he put it in terms that made sense. And you guys agree?
No, I disagree.
Huh?
Oh, I disagree.
You disagree? You did the bloody work. What are you talking about?
Can I say something?
Sure.
I feel that actually Thom is very modest about his actual creative input and hands-on work that he does on every project. That's my feeling. Because there's a certain consistency within the development of your work, which is, there's an evolutionary quality within the work. Still the same concepts and ideas, changing, developing, refined, and goes from one project to the next project. But throughout the last, I've been out of the office for now 30 years, every time I look at the work, I still see your hand, I still see your touch with every project. I know a lot of people work on those projects, but when you said that I push, and Gary said that's an understatement with Thom. You don't push, you run.
But this is, McKelly, and I want to turn this over. I should be careful here. It's funny. Thom said it feels like he's amongst family. I definitely feel like a distant cousin in this room, but still related. I really need to turn things over to Dean Ma and Hitoshi, who I expected to be sharing the stage with. And I want to do that, but I want to actually conclude with a compliment that goes to your point, McKelly, from Hernan Diaz Alonso. And I talked to Hernan after our breakfast, Thom, and I was saying we had a really interesting, kind of inspiring conversation. And I think Hernan gave you a compliment I'd like to pass on, which was, yeah, you know, the amazing thing, you leave a conversation with Thom, and you just want to work. You need to work. And I think that is, you know, whether, you know, however much the sensibilities are shared or determined, that seems like, you know, part of the key of it. But Dean Ma, if I could, please.
Right. So first, I just wanted to thank Thom for your always generous lecture. All lectures you have given is loaded with projects and ideas. I got to raise the first question because I'm the host here. Thom, I have actually my impression of you in this city is not only because you have created remarkable work that could really raise the level of architectural practice in the city. And I don't see another person still on the horizon who kind of fulfill that role in the near future. But it's also full of, I would say, kind of productive contradictions in your work and in your words, and actually certain paradigms you have carried through all this year. I just want to point at one to them, which you have always stated that your time in USC has been absorbed by what Ralph Noll has been kind of pushed and developed. If Ralph is really about natural forces, and the forces that versus form is a process that is reducing the form. In other words, never assume what the form is and allow the force actually work on the prime and drill down to its ultimate form. You can stop in any of the moment, but you never know what it is. But your process seems to be a assemblage. In other words, it's also adding. It's actually a reverse process as the force being reduced in the form that's given. There is a model that you've shown that is a kind of this pile of white mammoth. What is it? The powder.
As it was being milled. Yes. It was an early milled model of the Rensselaer,
yes.
the Rensselaer project.
Right. That may have demonstrated my kind of curiosity there, because
another school.
For a moment, I think Ralph Noll is coming with this sun ray and winds, and it's going to blow this form into something. But then when the form actually reduced, then what it appears to be a form that is somehow is not the result of that reducing or eroding forces. That is not. So I'm just trying to, because form to you is really powerful. If the reasons are kind of traced back to the forces, I just want to know were the influences of that USC-ness in terms of force, and then your form that is obviously anti.
Well, you know, again, I'd have to ask your students. I came out of a generation that ended the kind of the singularity of working under a master. And so when I showed up, the generation right in front of me, you were either Corbusier or Mies. I remember even in the school, the classes right around, they'd be throwing things at each other, and they were violently, it'd be like a religious experience or something. And it's like Shiites and Sunnis on the two sides. And that completely broke down as I showed up, and I explained there were all these very, very good, interesting people here. But they were all getting older, and there was a kind of an end of it. You could feel it was ending, and they'd done their primary work, and they were already protégés in a way of Schindler and Neutra. And something else is taking place. So again, the 1944 that comes up, and it would be also Wolf Prix, who's 1943. All of us, because I met Wolf in the 80s, and we went to dinner, and then within a half an hour, we found that we had a commonality. He was at the AA, I was getting the comic books with Jim Stafford, and we both took our name from Archigram, and we had the same root. And then very quickly, you talk about the group you're talking about that was all born in that period of time. The influences left, they were no longer architecture. Because I have to say, even at SC, Ralph was the one that left me a little kernel that I kept working with. That wasn't my main influence. The music was rock and roll, film, literature of all types. the huge political, social, cultural changes that have taken place. I lived under an era where I watched all my heroes be assassinated, both Kennedys and Martin Luther King, etc. When I listened to the anniversary of Martin Luther King, it brings tears to my eyes. It was completely, hugely influential on who I became as a young man. And this is a group of people that haven't experienced that, a person that you could admire at that level. It's a conversation I have with my sons, and we discussed their kind of pessimism in some way, because they missed that. It just didn't born in the same time. And I go, well, I was born in a time when there were people alive that had this power, this positive power that was therapeutic, that were just amazing. And whatever you think politically of Kennedy, listen to him speak, and the words he uses, and the ambition he has. And you're living in another age. We're in the complete opposite end of the bell curve right now. And anyway, so the influences were absolutely outside of architecture to start with. They weren't even architecture. And then we were stumbling to find our way again, and then postmodern hit, especially in this country. And we got slightly lost in that. The 2, 4, 6, 8, and some of my early projects were kind of lost in vernacular architecture. And I had no clue. I went to Harvard and came back with Rossi and Matthias Ungers and did the house, and I had no clue what I was doing. And I looked at it and said, let's go someplace else. But I was just totally winging it, because we were just learning piece by piece. And then the people here were doing that. They were experimenting. But they were very, a little more than now, I think. You guys have to tell me. We all fought for our own differences. We didn't have to agree with each other. And we admired each other. Coy and I did agree on nothing. A lot of people think we're violent enemies, and he's a dear, dear close friend of mine. Robert Mangurian, ditto. And Robert is a person I would say was one of the most respected teachers I've ever met in my life, and I have huge, huge honor of who he is as a person. And he's a little crazy, but he operates in a world that wouldn't be so odd if he was an artist or in theater or writer, right? He could be a lot of things and just be a normal guy. But in architecture, it's a pretty conservative profession. We don't have that kind of tolerance. But I grew up in a time in LA that pushed that tolerance of what architects were, which absolutely formed me, right? Because I'm of the gang. I'm the conservative one. I'm absolutely a conservative guy. But it pushed me in terms of these characters that I was dealing with in the city. But the city still ends up being this really, really vibrant place in terms of education. Because I think that's one of the unique things about LA. You're either in LA or New York, and they go back and forth, which is the strongest, which is maybe not even an interesting conversation. But clearly, if you're in LA, it's one of the only cities, it'd only be New York in the US, where there's a critical mass of the kind of questions being asked and the kind of arguments that are taking place that connect the academic world with the profession. And again, as you go from school to school, I'm amazed coming here. I forget myself. You look at the 3 schools, everybody that's teaching here knows each other, essentially, right? Hitoshi, he comes out of SCI-Arc. And it's just an amazing connected community here that gives the potential for continued new ideas and the kind of energy it takes to approach this field, yeah? And it makes the city a very, very unique place, and still is. And you guys I don't know how much you get around, but you also have the ability to connect. When I went out to Harvard, I spent time at MIT, and you're at Harvard, why not? It gets a different environment, and you have that here with the 3 main schools, and you've got another 4 feeder schools after that. There's a lot of institutions here.
This was a remarkable year for connecting those dots with all the Pacific Standard Time shows, and I did some quick math on those. And Tom, your work is included in a healthy majority of the shows in very different contexts and with a very different rhetorical arguments for why it's included or how it's set in contrast with not only the architects of your generation you're talking about, which happens in the Heretics show, but in, I think, a really compelling way in Sylvia Lavin's Everything Loose Will Land, which is a catalog all of you should own while they can still be purchased. That's
a beautiful show. That's a great one.
It's a phenomenal. I mean, she really makes the case for what makes LA She basically looks at art and architecture in the 1970s and explains why Los Angeles made different transdisciplinary options possible that simply weren't possible anywhere else. I think it really, the aggregate momentum of the Pacific Standard Time shows is really to explain why Los Angeles. I actually don't think it's a rivalry between LA and New York anymore. All of the advanced geometry realized in New York Cooper Union, Gary's 2 projects, Neil Denari's project over the High Line, all of the advanced geometry in New York from LA firms.
Weird.
You know, some good European space firms. Hitoshi.
Well, hi, my name is Hitoshi Abe. But I was a student like 25 years ago.
At least.
But I guess I will just connect this question back to this school. When I was at SAIA, it was 87.
Can you hear him?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if I could probably improve everyboud's night if this mic went away from me and other people.
Mine's good.
There you go. So when I was a student at SAIA in 87, and then I met all the figure you just described, and even a couple of people that I know also here was teacher. And then at that time, I could feel like there's a kind of interesting sort of community, and at that time I still could feel somehow architects were in church. But you also mentioned that in the lecture that you feel now that the people who is really controlling architects is shifting out, and then the architects started not to be more. And I feel similar things, and also at the same time, if you look at the young architects in LA, I feel also, sometimes I wonder if they are really in church. And I really want to hear your kind of idea about what's going on in LA, and are we still actually energetic as the leader?
Right. You know, it's funny, especially the whole group of people are talking about, and my instinct was it's either more difficult or tougher, and that the current generation is more passive. But then I started thinking about it, going, actually, I don't really, I think when you're starting architecture, you guys are you're hitting 20 or 21 or 22, however old you are, you have a certain, or you have to in architecture, have a certain optimism and energy and a kind of a thrust that's going to dive into this project. And I think what's happening today is that I'm at a place where I don't have the same kind of energy to enter the problem. And I can't figure out what I would do other than I've done it in another time and I figured it out because I'm someplace else, right? And so the problem is it's a context problem that my brain isn't working in a way what the hell I would do if I'm starting a practice, because that's not my problem. It's what do I do at this point in my practice? And I have a different energy level and a different set of things I bring into it. And there's just the same amount of talented people now as there were then. It's a bell curve. That doesn't change, right? It's the same. It's always the same. Definitely the environment has changed, but so has the whole profession. And that the potentials have changed at the same time. And how architecture is located in society has changed. And it's somehow is also adaptive to students that are part of a digital environment and to a non-physical. Again, I grew up in a physical environment, so I'm, with you guys, I'm another species. I built things and made things. I was a kid. I built cars and race cars, and I was physical, right? I have 2 sons that grew up, they don't even know what's under the hood. It's just something that they move, and it used to be a kind of a joke with women. They look at radios and cup holders. Well, that's what everybody does today. They'll buy a car, a cup holder and a good radio, and they have no idea. The physical is irrelevant. And I'm not in that generation, so I understand that I'm kind of out of touch. And the magazine, the whole culture I lived has disappeared. The magazines don't exist, books don't exist. We're in a transition of web and digital environments, and it's going to lead to something. It just keeps changing. But I'm finally still be optimistic. They'll figure it out. You'll get it. But what we haven't talked about is what's absolutely key that I thought you might have brought up is a certain persistence and a depth of your work. And you can't get around that. It's 24/7. I still wake up at 3 in the morning on a student work. I'm really upset because I can't figure out something that I want to talk to a student about, and I write a little note and go back to sleep. It takes, and it's lovely. It's really fantastic. It fills your life. You can't ask for anything more, I'm going to tell you, as a guy that's 4 months away from being 70, I've never had it's not easy, but I would never in a million years think of anything else other than being Mick Jagger that I'd want to do. And it's just, and it gets better as you get older. I'm way past the age where all kinds of friends of mine that are doctors and lawyers retired years ago and are sailing around the world in boats, and they're kind of bored as hell, and they die young because they're bored as hell. And it's fantastic, but it takes immense concentration and energy. And that's why, I don't know what it's like now. When I was here, 40 people came out of every 100, and the first year, 25% dropped out because they just wanted to. I didn't get to go to a football game or Friday night. People were partying, and Saturday night they're partying. I was in my bloody studio working with all the rest of my classmates, and a whole bunch of guys said, "Screw this, I'm out of here, and let's get a real profession." And that does not change. And you have to be, and it starts with school. You give everything in your life to it, and if you do that, you're going to get it back, guaranteed, right? But there's very little, if any, middle ground, right? And then again. As part of the culture of the office, and anybody here knows that, there's kind of a rule that everybody gets. Things don't leave the office until they've gone through a reiterative process that they're ready to leave the office. But it'd be no different if we're making BMWs. You talk to people that make very, very fine things. I just met the head of BMW was at this thing that Wolf was at the ECB in Frankfurt. And we had done a competition, lost to him on that BMW thing. And he remembered us and gave me a little book. And we talked about it. They're producing a zero energy car. They've got a team doing the second generation that's looking at the lubricant that still burns off in the pistons, that still gives off some. That's where they're at, right? That level of specificity, right? And it does not leave the shop until it operates in a certain way. And if you have one, you know it. These are people that know how to make a car and that are very, very persistent in making a high quality. And I think architects are a little sloppy that way, that there has to be a set of rules. When it leaves your office, it has a certain standard, and it has to do with performance, it has to do with certain technological finesse, as well as the design, etc. And you have to be strong. You're a leader. You're the one that pushes it through. And in an architectural office, like ours, there's a lot of leaders. There's a collective consciousness that I'm not the one that says it doesn't leave the office. A whole bunch of people say we're not ready yet, or they'll work in a way that, right? When it leaves, it means it left the office and it represents who we are.
Tom, if that sense of standards and a kind of obsession about the work remains constant, one thing that I think has grown more complicated in our generation, I'll put it strictly in our terms, is developing a clear sense of purpose. Mine is a generation in LA that's radically bifurcated between practices like Patrick's and mine that are trying to get houses realized, that in many respects are actually trying to begin our working lives, and I say begin in my 40s, which is with this much gray, embarrassing. But there are some of us that are trying to build practices. There is also actually a really compelling, arguably the more compelling end of our generation that are pursuing installations that are really, entering the kind of lottery ticket of competition entries, hoping that that whale comes in and takes them from 4 to 40 people in a week. Mine is a generation that's staked its bets in very, very different ways. I would argue polarized ways. And I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, but I know I chat with a lot of these guys. We keep in touch with each other, and we talk all the time. And I would have said that it hasn't changed that much. That the trajectory of architects, you still are heading for a certain place, and you want a certain scale of project, an urban project, public work, whatever. If you're from Amsterdam and you're Ben van Berkel, at 32, you get a huge bridge. That doesn't happen in this country. And it's not like you want to do, again, I'm not speaking for you, it's not necessarily you want to do residential work. You do residential work because that's the stuff you start with. And you've already got a big tower in China, and you have large-scale work. And it's just you're doing your early kind of work to get you to the next step. and making a name for yourself. And it's, to me, very much still part of being an American architect. That doesn't happen in a lot of cultures where you have those opportunities. And by the way, you should tell everybody you're 55 and you'd advance your career massively. You should model yourself as an architect. I'm 55. I'm ready to do like skyscrapers, and you'd be perfect. And go for the other direction. You look completely suitable, and just let it just take you right to the top.
Let me do this. Is it all right if we?
Yes.
I'm a little new to the format here, but are there questions from the audience for Thom?
I have a question. You mentioned that now that you're older, every good idea that you've had, or everything that you explore and rehash, is something that you thought of when you were 18. Is there something that you thought of when you were 18, or are there a couple big
I'm kind of teasing. I didn't quite mean that literally. I think the part of that is quite literal is I think there's certain propensities of your generation, the things that were compelling to you growing up, that stay with you because you're forming. Psychologists will say it at 5 years old up, whatever. You're a quite young person. You're forming your nature of how you see the world, right? As you're going through the process of socialization, and most people kind of end that at 17 or 18. They're done, and some people keep going, right? But the average person, it's at 17. You formed who you think the world's about. If it's religious, blah blah blah. You're formed, right? And again, that would be an issue for psychologists, psychiatrists. But it does. That vision of the world does propel really basic notions of how you see architecture within political, social, cultural, the terms that you see the world in. And we don't even know that. We have to wait a while for your generation. So we've got to wait 10 or 15 years, 20 years to see the product of that output before you can answer the question, who am I? Right? In terms of how does that affect the product of architecture, your notion of what architecture is or isn't. And it's how we're differentiated by generations, although I think that's kind of an old idea now. I don't think the world is separated by generations as much as by certain mental connections. But definitely there is a generational component to it. There's no question. It depends on how powerful it is. Make sense? And some of that, it kind of doesn't matter for you. You just have to follow. It's instinctual. There's no way of figuring that out, right? You just have to make hunches, and that's what everybody has to do. And those hunches will lead you somewhere, and you just take your best shot at it and see where that takes you. And then I think later you maybe see patterning, or it just becomes more evident as you see where that's leading you, right? And I think in your generation, you tell me, if you're coming from the U.S. anyway, it's a little bleaker because the world we're sharing power, we're sharing wealth, and things that if you could step back are probably really useful for the world, that we no longer dominate those things, and we're sharing it a bit. So other cultures now get to live a middle class life and produce things, and and that level, it's probably an extremely powerful thing. It isn't on a private level where you get less, and then we're in a place now where all the Europe and the U.S. has to take away social programs, kind of a very luxurious life we led as we kind of owned the world in economic and political terms. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? And but I mean, it's like out of the Depression came huge kind of creativity in every level, politically, culturally, artistically.
Over the last couple of years, just talking at schools, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about the future. However, a lot of things are cyclical, and I do feel like, I wrote a new introduction for Rainer Banham's Four Ecologies a couple of years ago, and I realized he published that in 1971 when LA was just a miserable place, smog-filled, riven by, it was helter-skelter, Manson-era LA. And there were a lot of reasons not to like LA, and Banham, for whatever collection of reasons, sort of saw through the smog as he chose to. I don't want to be starry-eyed about it, but I also feel like the generalized. I graduated into what I thought was a recession that proved otherwise pretty quickly. I do think there are cycles, and actually, if anything, the cycle feels like it's typically part of it.
It's funny too. It's how you can. I think you would find as you looked at various architects how much credence you give to living in your brain. And I'm a bit extreme that way. That I can't even separate. It's a joke on my family if I tell stories if they really happen to me. Because I confuse if I'm thinking about something or if it happened. I'll tell you this one story with you. You'll probably appreciate it. I was with, I went to Berlin to be in Wolf Brix's Kuchenblau, his 70th birthday. And we're sitting together and we're telling stories. And I was telling him a story about being in Moscow. And we were invited there. And I'm telling him this story and I'm going, God, it was this incredible scene I'll never forget. And we're in this, what is it, Chapinski, this really fancy hotel, and it's this incredibly over-the-top kind of service with plates of caviar this big, and I mean it's just totally nutty. And at midnight, the hotel really changes, and it gets a little racier, and an elevator opens up, and there's these 2-meter Russian girls that are completely naked, holding hands with a Korean guy. And he looks at me and kind of drops his jaw. And I'm with my wife and a whole bunch of friends, and I'm with him at the same table. And he looks at me and says, "Tom, that's my story. I told you that." So everything I said is like, duh, maybe yes, maybe no. And that was a kind of an extreme classic. And yeah, I just, if I think it's interesting, I decided I absorbed it. It was my story. And I honestly, I told it to 1 million people. I told that story because I thought it was the essence of being in Moscow.
This is definitely the way the Cold War was supposed to be. Are there any more, maybe one last question? And then, there is that.
Your visual research, is that more like an intellectual sort of research, or would you consider that a crossing with a lot of this technological research that you've done? Or how do you see that, those two things?
It's a continuation of exploring through the medium of drawing that has its own sets of laws and communication that's outside of the verbal, because that's a whole nother complex discussion. And again, in my generation, starting with Venturi and then immediately with Peter Eisman, there was a redefinition of architecture within intellectual terms. And now there's a new profession, you might even say. The Sarah Grahams and the Sylvia Lavins and the Jeff Kipnises and people I all grew up with, or more or less, they're either just after me in a generation. And through teaching more in the East Coast, you just hung out with these people and you run juries with them, and you had to you learned to kind of deal with the kind of dialogue, and then you went back and they kind of pushed you in another way. And you knew who Spinoza was, and you could go head to head with Kafka and on, and the characters, and you got, and that's not me at all. I'm very suspicious. That's not my medium, but I'm interested in it. It's interesting things. But there was a whole different development in that direction, which is still very much now, as you entered the profession, is still part of the profession, which is the intellectual quote kind of thinking. And for me, it's a little disconnected at times. Jeff and I just did a whole day, and I really don't agree too much with him. He's a very smart man. We're friends, and it could be an interesting day, but we're very, very different agreement of what a good architecture is. And I'm going to be much more physical and connected to the reality of architecture artistically. And I'm much less interested in the talk, and I'm more interested in the walk. And I'm interested in the reality of an idea. And drawing is the way I started learning architecture, and it's one of my methods of learning and exploring. And in this case, I'm looking very specifically for organizational ideas, because that's all we do. We make things coherent, we organize things. And so it seems like that's not kind of an uncommon thing to do. You look for, by the way, how do I organize complex things? And you need some beginning system to doing that. And I think it's attached ideas, quote, intellectual. Again, so I can attach it clearly. It belongs to Duchamp, and it belongs to, we could go through this whole kind of history of chance behavior. But finally, that has nothing to do with it when you're working. You're in the world of that thing, and everything strips away. Everything. There's nothing. It's just you and your intuition of moving things with a broad idea that guides you, that clearly, I guess, would be intellect. It's thought. It comes from the thought. But you're always challenging that, because if something happens that violates that, the idea is gone. And now you're going back and forth between this play of idea and thinking and thing that you're making. And you realize that the ideas form the thing, but are provisional. There is no law. We didn't get into the broader philosophy. I believe in nothing as a permanent thing. Nothing. Everything's provisional. There is no philosophy, religion, idea. Everything is just temporary. And it seems like we're wired differently that way. And they're doing some studies now that the brain actually, there's people that need rules, and their brain is set up that way. And there's people that lead nests of them, and I'm the second. Because I have I was brought up in a very conservative religious family, and I have no need for that. In fact, I find it kind of disturbing, and I need complete openness, and I'm totally comfortable with that. And in your work, you realize that you're forming rules, but the rules are under investigation as well as the thing. And so I'm going to always go with the thing and then rewrite the rule. It won't be the other way around. I'm not going to be orthodox about, Eisenman would be more orthodox. Comes up with an idea, draws it, and it validates the thinking. In a way, I'm going to be the reverse. I'm going to want the thing to somehow challenge its initial premise and take you someplace else. And so it's going to be a balance between left and right, I guess. And it'd be people like Irwin. You could rattle off certain people that have been interested, that are clearly very kind of focused and have a rationality about their work, but finally make inventions, right, that are much more intuitive, that take them somewhere. I don't know if you're Seeing is Forgetting. Have you guys read that? That should be a given. That's absolutely one of the clearest notions of an artist. And it's so straight up with no intellectual bullshit. It's just really straight, and it's great. He talks about the painting, and he'll lay down, take a nap for 4 hours, and then some girl comes over, and they have sex for the next 5 hours, and he's tired and quits that day and starts again. And it's just totally hilarious. And it's a very, very major painting that just sold for $26 bucks.
And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of horse betting.
Yeah.
Robert Irwin famously made a lot of money betting on horses through his.
That's right.
I hope actually, with the Broad finishing and Liz Diller are likely here in the next year, I hope there's a conversation between the two of you about Duchamp. Because I'm reminded tonight, there are only a few architects that try to take up that, what I believe actually is a kind of nominalist tradition, what you just described of setting up conditions, but not necessarily rules to push work forward.
But talk about that, just one last thing. It seems like your generation, it'd be really interesting, because it seems like architecture is in transition again. There's not a clear mandate. Right, the digital thing seemed to occupy us for 15 or 20 years, and now it's just standard. Everybody, it's just the growth curve is kind of flattened out, like the computer, right? Computers, you used to buy one every 6 months, and now they flattened out. You can go for 3 years, and I think that happens with a conceptual idea too. It seems to me it'd be a good time to kind of relocate architecture as a project, and you need some historical base. Kind of what have been the preoccupations of the 20th century, and then you're finding through that kind of where are the territories that are still open. And some of them are broader, like the urban versus architecture. There's a whole other conversation. But some of them are actually within the thinking, right? That picking up on project that there's still places for growth, right?
I think that's all here. I think with that,
terrific.
I'm not the one to draw the curtain here, but I will.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.